Well, unless you can always produce well-baked ideas, I suggest a certain amount of tolerance of
celebration.
The problem is that ideas don't come with, you know, the little warranty labels that say this idea can be returned to the manufacturer if it fails within the first 6 months. And some ideas take a while to fail. Perfectly, it's that business of acting on limited knowledge. You have to do something in some context, and it turns out to be pruit ego, and you go oops in a really loud, noisy way, and that's not good, but it's somewhat unavoidable. You just like to make it statistically less likely.
I tend to think of the words of practice, meaning, and practice in the sense that we are all practicing. And you know, I don't think these things, like there isn't an ideal design, there isn't a best design, or I don't think these things are knowable. And then I also think that there is so much in the world that is changing that, you know, it's a really dynamic conditions in which we're trying to, you know, do this kind of work. So it's more like alertness to those conditions and this notion of practice that I think are really helpful than, than sort of talk, yeah, I guess that's how so all of these ideas come forward and you put them out there, you watch what happens around them, you're adaptive to them. Sometimes the thing that seems half-baked has a real kernel in it. So it just feels much more of an organic kind of process to me in a certain way.
If you think about it, when steam engines were just coming around, the gauge of rail lines was really flexible. Anybody that could make a steam engine and make rails could put them together any way they felt like. And the problem was that people made different decisions. And that created, you know, in as much as the rolling stock becomes part of a system that has to work across it, you had competition between these, and who knows whether the right, you know, rail gauge was ultimately picked or whether it was just the biggest pockets that bought the most rail. You know, it's not really possible to tell within what are essentially comparable ideas. And that's just a really simple kind of example. But
it should have been more, I've been a little lost in there, specifically the theory of change.
Okay.
Right? The theory of change around a specific set of practices of speculative design. There's a lot of people, Lisa, you must be used to it, who would probably suit that on and say that's a ridiculous way to affect social change. There's, you know, forget about that. That's, you know, we'll dismiss it out of hand as something that's a non-starter. So I think that we're constantly. I know there's things that I feel knee-jerk about when I see them, you know, in this department or, you know, my work day to day. In your own work, you're dealing with these different kinds. Research through design is not something everyone wants to do. Says, oh, this is great, let's do that. We need more of this in the world. And others do, and find that it is effective. So there's something here about sort of recognizing other people's other strategies of affecting change and within our own commitment to them as people that want to work in multidisciplinary masses. I don't know.
Before we get a response to that, I think it's a really important topic. I just want to be respectful of people's time because we did say that the panel would be over at 1:30 and we passed that mark. For anyone that needs to leave, please go ahead. Are your panelists, are you able to stay a little longer? Because there's one more question I'd like to tackle. So first, any response to this? Yeah.
So you did ask a question about theories of change. I can't speak for anyone else, right? But so I absolutely believe social change happens through movements, through social movements. And in particular, the theories of social movements that I tend to describe in material body work is referred to as new social movements, right? So this was the notion that movements are in part built around material needs and are largely concerned with marshaling resources, but also have a very strong cultural and identity connotation and component. Right? To be part of a movement is to construct your identity within that way you see yourself as an activist, and that's sort of the crucial element to building a movement, is helping people see themselves that way, supporting that identification. I say that because that's a way of understanding social change that can account for a broad range of practices, right? And I think I've done a lot of very applied building communication systems for protester kind of work, and it's really clear what the relationship is between those projects and the social change movement, giving tools to activists to use. Really clear. But the other thing that you get to talk about when you think about social movements as cultural-based movements is you can talk about the ways that ideas and spectacle, right, also contribute to those movements because they allow people to see their interests represented in various ways. They facilitate various forms of participation so that you can see oneself taking an action and that reinforces that association. And so that also allows a space for what is referred to sometimes as speculative design, that can be called critical art, or social engaged practice, whatever frame. There's a way to understand cultural activity within that frame. Now that said, not all speculative design would meet those criteria, right? So Batu's example, if you make a beautiful design project and no one sees it.
She said no one wanted it.
Well, I'm getting there. That was the next thing. Or no one identifies with it, or it just fails. Like, it can fail, right? So it's not always saying everything is therefore important and really valid. But I think, you know, for me personally, it's important to have ways of understanding social change that can account for the material as well as the cultural, the spiritual, if you will, over the different modes of being, understand how they all intersect together. And I would argue that, in fact, any meaningful social change has to be based in these movements, or it doesn't really go anywhere. That would be the
I'd argue that, for example, if it was half-baked, this idea, that maybe there's too much pressure on the designer. So it's more about what you do with this idea rather than the idea itself. So, for example, you have to give it some patience, and so in the startup culture, it's this really terrible line like, always fail early. Everything fails early, and then it's about how you tweak it afterwards and how you change the context. So, for example, this really beautiful idea that no one wants, probably because the designer is too lazy or arrogant to show it to a different spectrum. For example, this really crazy invasive use thing I was saying, where we ended up feeding them native. That's in production of the national TV, having a reality TV show series all about how the nation is going to start eating invasive products. So it's kind of I think the idea of design itself is sort of reaching wider and wider where it could go, and it needs a lot of flexibility, not just in the processes, but also in the markets. We can't. That was the only reply I remember. But we can no longer look at people in terms of users and consumers. We really have to be as tactful as we can and be as flexible as we can. Looking at our relationship with other people and companies. Great. So I have one last question, and I encourage anyone to speak up with other questions as well. But this is particularly for the class that I was teaching. Just how can your work help PhD students in design consider these different approaches to technology, design, and research through design? This is now oriented towards a specific project.
Are there PhD students in design?
Go for it.
What that is a open question, but I'm sure it isn't happening. Right, so I'll just start there. So I won't tell you what my work has to do with What I can say is I think how the work that I've been doing from PhD students in a range of fields that are somehow touching design. It's a slightly different thing. What I try to do in my own work, and I'm thinking again about the combination of the design kind of work I do as well as the scholarship. One of the things that I think is helpful is to help students understand the distinction between those two things. Right? We can do design, we can do scholarship. I'm not convinced they're the same. I think there's often a real attempt to conflate them as they're not always productive. So
What are you pointing to? What are these attempts?
well, so my PhD is from the Media Lab, right? I think there's a huge body of work there that we could point to as not actually productive. Well, there's lots of work we can point to as not productive. That's not quite right now. They already gave me the degree. What I mean is not particularly productive in the sense of advancing a body of design scholarship. Because, what often came out of, and I'll just pick on that word because it's safe, is, projects where you would have a design loosely constrained project, a bunch of making activity, and then a kind of afterthought of, oh, I gotta write this up now. And then some document is produced and you're done, right? And that's not actually scholarship. That's a bunch of engineering activity that maybe had some impact, maybe it was wonderful in all kinds of ways and should be celebrated as wonderful engineering activity, but it's not actually a dissertation, and it's not actually scholarship, and so I don't know that that is what a PhD should look like, right? And so the first thought I have is like, I think, and again, the design field is wrestling with this right now, right? What actually constitutes doctoral level scholarship and research in design? I think that's a wide open question that I'm happy to contribute to since.
Okay. Ted, when you think about positioning design closer to the arts and humanities, how does that change kind of how you think about scholarship, design scholarship?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I'm hesitating because, as I said, I'm not trying to advance it. I don't have a particularly normative vision of what that should look like. Well, I do, but I know I shouldn't. So I'm trying to that. So, but I think I don't know. I think there's some interesting models that we can draw. I think my own work I pull pretty heavily from anthropology and sociology, just in the way I tend to write and think. So I think there's a model there, right? And we talked a little bit about these approaches. The other models that I think are quite compelling, actually probably better, would be perhaps looking at things like, I think social work is a great model for design. I think nursing is a great model for design. And I say this because these are fields that, been around for a while, right? And they have at their core a service-oriented practice. They also have a notion of research within the field. I think they've done a really good job of identifying the difference between the research activity, the practice activity, developing appropriate curriculum for both of those kinds of things, differentiating between undergrad and master's and PhD. I think there's a lot of prior work we can draw on. And I think those fields are particularly well suited for design in ways that, again, if I'm sitting in an HCI type of room, I'm going to say, just because I would, that engineering frankly doesn't do and doesn't offer us. So when I say it's, particularly with regard to research and regard to graduate education, I think we've been staring at engineering about as long as we need to, and I think we, as a field, to do well to start looking elsewhere.
So I have a question related to that because I have personal interest
Yes.
in the answer.
Yeah.
So what would a design PhD dissertation look like? Because
They exist.
they do exist, but I'm asking Ted what he thinks
Again, like, let's let 1,000 flowers bloom here. I don't want a template. I think there's a few different models, right? The one that I'm familiar with, in some ways the easiest one to do, which is not a bad thing. Is the one where you, again, it's that sort of, it's kind of taking an anthropological approach to design practice, right? And that can be, as we've seen lots of dissertations that are, researcher goes, spends time in design studio, watch what happens, come back and read it up. There are some approaches or models where, students take more of a kind of action research or take reflective practitioner approach to try to do that same kind of interrogation of their own practice over time. I think that's really valuable and rich work, but hard, and you need a strong set of people around you to keep you in custody, so you're not just patting yourself on the back all the time. I think those are really familiar, easy models. I don't know what the other models look like. I think that's, for me, why it's an exciting time to be working in graduate design education right now, because it's a very open question. And I think one of the things that I like doing is working with PhDs to figure that out.
Yeah, I think it's hard within, since we're in an HCI room, I guess.
Yeah.
I think it's hard because currency is in papers, in
Yep.
specific types of papers.
Yep.
So what does that do for, does more design really practice that isn't so dependent on writing it up in a specific format?
Right. And again, we can talk about the fraught relationships between design and HCI for a while.
We don't need to.
We can do that
Other
another time.
discussion.
Well, let me ask a question. It's actually kind of a question of Tad, but it's related. But let's say somebody said, well, what I'm interested in is what have been the successful design moves for affecting a certain kind of social activism. And I can identify some effective things, and one of them I identify is your Sandra Ray project. And I find other projects, and the commonality across them is this insight that they found the place where whatever it is that you do as a provocative innovation actually moves data into a pre-existing civic something, where something is recorded and then the city has to deal with it. So then this becomes a dissertation that has looked at a number of these designs, perhaps has done some, the author perhaps has done some, and then I guess the question that, this is a fascinating question with Tad, but what I look for in a dissertation, the question I ask is, what is the new knowledge? What do we know now that we didn't know before? And from a dissertation like that, I would say, what I know now are these insights. So if I too wanted to think about doing that kind of design social activism, I'm not starting from square one again. I can build on that, and I might be able to extract something from some of Lisa's work as well, and that to me would be a really exciting PhD. But I feel like it violates or pushes up against the. It's a move towards generalized.
So right. So yeah, I think that would be a lovely dissertation.
Okay, so now we have to find out why that counts as lovely.
Well,
but
here's the only rub I would make. I think that would be a lovely thing to do, right? The suggestion I would make though is that it's the question of what constitutes new knowledge, right? Whether that needs to be framed as you did as, okay, therefore, if you're going to do civic activism for the environment, this is what you should do, right? That's one kind of.
I don't know that one would. I guess I would not see that as the prescriptive part that you just constructed is not something that I would put there.
Okay.
So I think I don't think that generating new knowledge carries with it the that kind of prescription. It's left to whoever is going to come to that knowledge and appropriate it, how they're going to appropriate it.
I think that's great. And so the one addition I might make to that is in addition to that kind of knowledge production, where I might suggest, I think what I'm struggling with is like, where do we set the bar for what constitutes new knowledge, right? And here's and